The Grand Bank's lobby in New York was a scene of power and wealth, where the city's elite and business titans navigated through million-dollar deals and subdued conversations. The shimmering lights bounced off the polished marble floors, reinforcing an ambiance of luxury and exclusivity. Tellers operated with efficiency, managers conversed in hushed tones, and the faint jingling of jewelry blended with the muted sound of expensive shoes tapping against the marble. Everything there radiated a sense of untouchable perfection, leaving no room for anything out of the ordinary. However, that afternoon, the atmosphere was suddenly disrupted. A man entered through the revolving glass doors. His steps were uncertain, almost as if he doubted his right to be there. He was clad in worn-out, grimy clothes that hung loosely on his frail body. His shoes were battered, barely holding together, and his unkempt hair covered a face etched with fatigue and the harsh realities of street life. His eyes carried a mix of shame and desperation, silently pleading for a shred of dignity. He approached one of the tellers, head lowered, hands trembling. When he finally lifted his eyes, his voice was barely more than a whisper. "Please, a handout. I just need some change to eat," he implored, keeping his gaze on the floor, as if too afraid to confront the reactions his request might provoke. Before the teller could respond, 2 security guards swiftly closed in, like predators zeroing in on their prey. They were tall, imposing figures, clad in flawless black suits, exuding an authority that came not only from their uniforms, but also from the undeniable awareness that they were untouchable in this environment. "Get out of here now!" one of them barked, his voice booming and sharp, echoing through the lobby. He seized the man's arm with unnecessary force, his grip on the frail limb full of contempt. The man tried to resist, muttering something unintelligible, but the response was quick and merciless. "What do you think you're doing here?" the other guard snarled, shoving the man toward the exit. The despair on his face was obvious, but it only seemed to intensify the guard's anger, who were now dragging him out without a hint of compassion. His cries of humiliation pierced the air, but nobody around seemed to care. This was a place where wealth reigned supreme, and there was no room for poverty. The bank's clientele observed the scene with detached curiosity, some with a hint of disgust, others with almost cruel indifference. To them, the man was merely a disturbance, a fleeting stain on the perfect canvas of their lives. They stepped aside, murmuring to each other, commenting on the absurdity of someone like him trying to invade their world. Sitting on one of the leather sofas near the entrance, Michelle Richardson watched the entire scene in silence. She was a commanding presence even in her old age, with a straight posture and the piercing gaze of someone who had lived long enough to understand the harshness of the world. Her grey hair was carefully styled, and her hands, adorned with rings of precious stones, rested one on top of the other in her lap. To many, Michelle was the epitome of New York's elite, wealthy, influential, and, to those who didn't know her well, perhaps even indifferent to the harsher realities of life. But at that moment, as she watched the brutality with which the man was treated, something inside her stirred. It wasn't just the injustice of the situation that disturbed her, but an uncomfortable feeling, a familiar pain that began to resurface. Then, something caught her attention in an unexpected way. On the man's wrist, as he was being dragged by the guards, she noticed a watch. It was an old watch, with a worn leather strap, but still intact. A small detail, perhaps, but enough to make Michelle's heart race. That watch, she knew it very well. For a moment, the world around Michelle seemed to stop. The sound of shoes, the conversations, everything became a distant blur as her mind returned to the past, to a time when that watch was on the wrist of someone she loved deeply, a grandson who disappeared years ago without a trace. The pain of that loss accompanied her every day, But the watch, that watch was a physical reminder of the void he left behind. Michelle felt a lump form in her throat, and a fierce determination took hold of her. It couldn't be just a coincidence. There was something more to that scene, something she needed to understand. She rose from her seat with the elegance that had always characterized her, but now with a new urgency in her movements. She approached the guards, who were still holding the man, now almost fainting from fear and humiliation. "Let him go," Michelle said firmly, her voice cutting through the air with the authority that came from decades of power and respect. The guards hesitated, confused, but soon released the man, who fell to the floor, breathing with difficulty. Michelle knelt beside him, her eyes still fixed on the watch. "Where did you get that?" she asked, her voice now soft, but loaded with an intensity the man couldn't ignore. He looked at her, still trying to understand what was happening, and murmured, "It was a young man. He gave it to me, said I needed it more than he did." Michelle felt a chill run down her spine. The man's words were vague, but something in his tone, in his gaze, made her know she was on the right track. At that moment, amidst the chaos and indifference surrounding her, she realized that a new and unexpected journey was just beginning. A journey that would bring buried secrets to light, and that would finally lead her to the truth about what really happened to her grandson. But Michelle also knew that the truth could be painful, more than she ever imagined, and that the path to it would be full of obstacles and dark revelations that would change lives forever. Michael Richardson's life had always been marked by moments of intense social brilliance and deep personal tragedies. Coming from an influential family and accustomed to living under public scrutiny, Michelle learned early on to maintain appearances. She married young to a renowned businessman, Robert Richardson, and together they built an empire that extended beyond business, reaching into the heart of New York society. Yet, despite being surrounded by all the luxury and power, Michelle always found her true happiness in the small moments of family intimacy. Her greatest treasure was her grandson, Dylan. From a young age, Dylan showed an insatiable curiosity, a brilliant intelligence that captivated everyone around him. He wasn't just a promising young man, he was someone who brought a special light into Michelle's life. She adored him in a way she had never been able to with her own daughter, Anna. Anna had always been a distant, cold figure, more concerned with maintaining the family's perfect image than forging genuine bonds with her mother or her son. Dylan, however, was different. He had his grandfather's determination and Michelle's compassionate heart, which made her his favorite confidant. Early on, Michelle noticed that Dylan didn't feel comfortable in the role that was being imposed on him. Instead of following in his father's and grandfather's footsteps in business, he was interested in music, art, and social causes that his family viewed with a certain disdain. To Michelle, however, these interests of Dylan only made him more special. She always supported him, encouraging his talents and giving him the space to explore the world in his own way. However, as Dylan grew older, tensions within the Richardson family began to emerge more intensely. Alan, Dylan's father and Anna's ex-husband, was increasingly involved in shady business dealings. His activities were, to many, an open secret. There was speculation about his investments in dubious ventures and his ties to people of questionable character. Michelle, despite her attempts to intervene, felt she was losing control of the situation. Dylan, who had always been sensitive to family disputes, began to distance himself, spending more time away from home and getting involved with people his parents would never approve of. He sought refuge in the least likely places, live music bars, small art studios, and even activist movements that fought for causes the Richardson family considered a waste of time. It was during one of these escapes that Dylan met people who would change his life forever. In one of those hidden bars, In the East Village, he found a group of young people living on the fringes of society, driven by a desire to change the world, but also by a deep dissatisfaction with everything considered normal and acceptable. Dylan was captivated by their passion, by the way they saw the world with different eyes than his family. It was there that he began to feel at home, but also where he began to lose himself. By the age of 19, Dylan was completely alienated from the life his family had planned for him. He could no longer stand the gala parties, the formal dinners, and the discussions about investments and business. All of that seemed empty and meaningless in the face of the new realities he had discovered. His grandmother, Michelle, was the only one he still confided in, although even with her, he had begun to keep secrets. One night, after a violent argument between his parents, Dylan made a decision that would change his life forever. He went to his grandmother's apartment, where he found Michelle sitting in her favorite chair, reading a book of poetry, something they used to do together when he was a child. He watched her for a moment, in silence, before entering the room. "Grandma," he began, his voice heavy with emotion, "I can't live like this anymore. I need to leave. I need to find my own way." Michelle looked up from her book, feeling the weight of those words. She knew something was wrong, but hearing it from her grandson was a blow she wasn't prepared to bear. "Dylan, my dear, what do you mean?" "Leave for where?" Dylan approached, kneeling beside her chair, holding her hands tightly. "I'm not sure exactly where, but I know I can't stay here. I feel suffocated. I feel like I'm living a life that's not mine, and it's killing me, slowly." Michelle felt tears beginning to form in her eyes. She had always known Dylan was different, but she had never imagined he was so unhappy. "Dylan, we can find a solution. I'll always be here for you no matter what happens. Just don't do anything impulsive, please." But Dylan had already made up his mind. He kissed his grandmother's hand and smiled, a sad and resigned smile. "I already have, Grandma. I just wanted you to know that I love you more than anything, and I'll never forget you. But I have to go now." Before Michelle could respond, he got up and walked out the door. She remained there, seated, paralyzed by the feeling that something terrible was about to happen, but unable to prevent the inevitable. That night, Dylan left his grandmother's house and never returned. He left a note for his parents, saying that he had to leave, that he could no longer bear the life he was living, and that he needed to find his own peace far from the family's expectations and pressures. And so he disappeared. The days that followed were tormenting for Michelle. She used every resource at her disposal to find Dylan. She hired private detectives, used her influence to pressure the police, but all to no avail. It was as if Dylan had simply evaporated. The pain of uncertainty was unbearable, but Michelle never lost hope of one day finding her grandson. Meanwhile, Dylan found himself increasingly lost. Without money, without a place to stay, he wandered the streets of New York, trying to remain invisible. He knew his family was looking for him, but the fear of being found and forced back into the life he so despised kept him hidden. He began to blend in with those living on the margins of society, the forgotten, the invisible, and discovered a side of the city he had never imagined existed. It was on a cold winter night, in a run-down neighborhood of New York, that Dylan had his first encounter with the man who would change the course of his life. After days without direction, not knowing where to sleep or what to eat, Dylan found shelter in a small church, where a group of volunteers was distributing food to the homeless. He was hungry, exhausted, and desperate. When he finally got his meal, he noticed a man sitting in a corner alone, with a lost look in his eyes. Something about that man made him stop. Dylan approached, driven by a compassion he barely understood. "Do you need anything?" he asked, his voice filled with a kindness that seemed out of place in that hostile environment. The man, whose name Dylan never came to know, just looked at him with a mix of distrust and gratitude. "Just a chance to move on," he murmured, barely lifting his eyes. It was then that Dylan, moved by a sudden impulse, took off the watch from his wrist, the only physical reminder of his previous life, a gift from his grandmother Michelle when he turned 18. "Take it," he said, extending the watch to the man. "It's all I have, but it might be more useful to you." The man hesitated for a moment, incredulous, but finally accepted the watch with trembling hands. "Thank you," was all he could say before disappearing into the darkness. Dylan watched as the man vanished into the night, feeling a strange sense of relief. Leaving the watch behind seemed symbolic, a final break with his old life, with the expectations he had never been able to meet, with the guilt he carried for not being what everyone expected. That night, he decided he would never return. He would become someone new, somewhere no one knew him, where he could finally be free. Time passed, and Michelle continued her search. The following years were filled with an unyielding and solitary quest. Each lead that turned out to be fruitless devastated her a little more, but she never gave up. The watch she had given her grandson, with a dedication engraved on the back, "With love, Grandma," was for her a symbol of the love that would never die, even if Dylan was lost forever. The pain of not knowing what had happened to him was a constant weight on her heart. Then one day, while on one of her rare outings in the city, Michelle entered a New York bank to handle trivial matters. She was used to dealing with the formalities of the financial world, always with an air of dignity and control. But that day, something out of the ordinary caught her attention. A man, clearly out of place in that environment of wealth and power, walked into the lobby with hesitant steps. He seemed to be homeless, with worn-out clothes and a desperate look that begged for any crumb of humanity. Michelle watched, disturbed, as he approached the tellers, only to be brutally confronted by two bank security guards. The harsh words and aggressive gestures of the men left her indignant. They pushed him, dragged him, as if his existence was an affront to the orderly world in which they lived. Michelle felt a wave of compassion and sadness wash over her. But it was when the man raised his arm, trying to protect himself, that something caught her attention. On his wrist was the watch, the same watch she had given to Dylan. For a moment, everything around. Michelle stopped. The sound of expensive shoes on marble, the muffled conversations, everything became distant as she fixed her eyes on that so familiar piece. Her heart raced, and a whirlwind of emotions consumed her, hope, fear, and an old pain that had never fully healed. She knew she had to intervene, that she needed to find out where the man had gotten the watch. She approached the guards, her voice firm and unwavering, and demanded they let the man go. They hesitated, but yielded to her command, letting him fall to the ground. Michelle knelt beside him, her eyes still fixed on the watch, and urgently asked, "Where did you get this?" The man, confused and frightened, muttered something about a young man who gave him the watch years ago. A young man who seemed as lost as he was. Michelle felt a chill run down her spine. She knew she was facing an important lead, possibly the key to unraveling the mystery that haunted her life. There, on the cold floor of the bank, amidst the indifference of others, Michelle realized that her search was not over. In fact, it was just beginning, and she was determined to follow this new path, no matter how painful or difficult it might be. With her heart full of renewed hope, but also weighed down by uncertainties, Michelle decided she would do everything to discover the truth about what really happened to Dylan. And as the man watched her with tired, weary eyes, she knew they were about to embark on a journey that would forever change their lives. Michel had never felt so close to an answer as she did at that moment. The watch, the only tangible clue to emerge in years, stirred a mix of hope and apprehension within her. The memory of Dylan's face, his contagious laughter, and the pain in his eyes the last time she saw him, haunted her thoughts as she helped the man up from the cold floor of the bank. He trembled, not only from the cold that penetrated his tattered clothes, but also from the fear that seemed to dominate him. "You're safe now," Michel said, trying to convey calm, though, inside, she was in turmoil. "Let's get out of here. We'll find a place where we can talk." The man, still distrustful, looked at her with dull eyes, full of the mistrust that life on the streets had instilled in him. He hesitated, but Michel's firm voice and determined gaze seemed to convince him that she meant him no harm. She led him out of the bank, ignoring the curious and judgmental glances from customers and employees. As they walked, Michel noticed how fragile he was. Each step seemed an effort for him, as if his body was on the verge of collapsing under the weight of years of suffering. Michel took the man to her car, an elegant black sedan that seemed out of place on the busy street crowded with hurried people. She helped him into the back seat and, without saying a word, sat behind the wheel. She didn't have a specific destination in mind, but she knew she needed to get him out of there. She needed a place where they could talk safely. She drove through the streets of New York with an almost obsessive focus, ignoring the traffic and the flashing lights around her. Her thoughts were fixed on Dylan, on what this man could reveal. Finally, she decided to take him to a discreet hotel far from the city center, where she knew they wouldn't be disturbed. Upon arriving at the hotel, Michel helped the man out of the car and led him into the lobby. The receptionist, a young woman with curious eyes, watched them for a moment before giving them a room on the top floor. Michel insisted on a comfortable room where the man could rest and recover. She knew she needed to earn his trust if she wanted to obtain any useful information about Dylan. As soon as they reached the room, Michel helped the man sit in a chair near the window. He was exhausted, and she could clearly see how cruel life on the streets had been to him. His face was marked by deep wrinkles and scars, his eyes sunken and dull. Michel approached slowly, sitting on the bed in front of him. "What's your name?" she asked, trying to sound as gentle as possible. The man looked at her for a long moment, as if evaluating whether he could trust her. "John," he finally replied, his voice hoarse and hesitant. "John, I'm Michel. I really need your help. The watch you're wearing, it belonged to my grandson, Dylan. He disappeared years ago, and I'm desperate to find him. You said a young man gave you this watch. Can you tell me more about him? Who was he? Where did you meet him?" John lowered his gaze to the watch on his wrist, as if seeing it for the first time. A mix of emotions crossed his face: confusion, sadness, maybe even regret. "I remember him," he began, his voice coming out in a murmur. "He was a young man. He had a lost look, like he didn't know where to go or what to do with his life. I found him on a cold night when I was wandering the streets. He was as lost as I was." Michel held her breath, feeling a tightness in her chest. "What did he say to you? How was he?" "He was sad, Mom. Very sad. But he was kind. He gave me the watch and said I needed it more than he did. He said it was all he had of value, but that it no longer meant anything to him. After that, he just disappeared into the night." Michel felt a solitary tear roll down her face. The image of Dylan, wandering the streets, desolate and hopeless, was almost unbearable. She quickly wiped away the tears, not wanting to show weakness. She needed to be strong for Dylan's sake. "John, do you have any idea where he might have gone? Did anyone else see him? Did he say where he was going? John slowly shook his head. No, ma'am. I don't know where he went. But I heard about a place where people like him, people who are running, sometimes go. It's a shelter, but it's not like the others. It's more discreet, almost as if it's a place for those who want to disappear. Do you know where it is? Michelle asked, hope renewed in her chest. John hesitated before answering. It's hard to find. They don't like outsiders, but I can try to take you there. Michelle nodded, resolute. I'll help you, John. We'll leave here and get you to a safe place. But I need you to help me find this place. If there's any chance Dylan is there, I have to try. With that, Michelle made a quick call to her assistant, instructing her to arrange clean clothes, food, and medical care for John. While they waited, she ordered room service and sat with John as he ate with a voracity that revealed how malnourished he was. Each bite he took seemed to revive a part of his humanity, and Michelle felt a deep relief as she watched him recover, albeit slowly. Later that night, after John had taken a bath and dressed in clean clothes, he lay down on the hotel bed and fell asleep almost instantly. Michelle stayed awake, sitting in the chair where he had been before. She looked out the window at the city lights, feeling the mix of exhaustion and determination that had dominated her life in recent years. The next morning, John woke up with a bit more color in his face, and, for the first time, a bit more confidence. Michelle knew he was still wary, but she also knew he understood the importance of what was at stake. They couldn't waste any more time. Michelle took him back to her car, and together they set out to find the shelter John had mentioned. He gave directions as best he could, based on his confused and fragmented memories. The route took them through deteriorated neighborhoods, where decay and poverty brutally the luxury Michelle was accustomed to. Even so, she was undeterred. There was too much at stake. After a few hours of searching, John finally pointed to a narrow, dimly lit street. "It's down there," he said, a noticeable nervousness in his voice. "I think the place is further in, near an abandoned building." Michelle parked the car in a discreet spot, and they got out. The streets were almost deserted, with only a few people visible, who seemed more like shadows than humans. John led Michelle through a narrow alley, full of trash and graffiti, until they reached a building with a worn facade, almost imperceptible. "This is it," John whispered. "They don't like visitors." Michelle took a deep breath, trying to stay calm. She knew that any mistake could compromise her chance of finding Dylan. She approached the door carefully and knocked 3 times, as John had instructed her. There was a moment of absolute silence before the door was partially opened, revealing a middle-aged man with a stern expression. "What do you want?" he asked bluntly. "I'm looking for someone," Michelle said, trying to sound confident despite her nervousness. "A young man who might have come here. His name is Dylan. He disappeared years ago." The man looked her up and down, as if assessing whether she deserved an answer. Finally, he opened the door a bit more. "We don't know anyone by that name here, but if you want, you can ask around. I can't guarantee you'll find what you're looking for." Michelle nodded and entered, with John right behind her. The inside of the building was gloomy, with peeling walls and old, worn furniture. There were few people visible, some sitting in dark corners, others talking in low voices. The place exuded a sense of contained despair, as if it were a refuge for those who had nowhere else to go. She began to ask discreet questions, describing Dylan as detailed as possible. She mostly received blank stares or evasive responses. Some said they had never seen him, others just shrugged, as if life there had erased any interest in helping others. John accompanied her, saying little, but with an expression of growing anxiety. After an hour of fruitless searching, Michelle began to lose hope. Every no she heard felt like a blow to her determination. But then, while talking to an elderly woman sitting in one of the corners, she finally found a lead. "Dylan," the woman repeated. "I think I heard that name before, but he's not here anymore. If it's the same boy I'm thinking of, he stayed here for a while, but then he left, said he needed to keep running, that he couldn't stop." Michelle felt her heart race. "Do you know where he went?" The woman shook her head. "I'm not sure, but I heard he was scared of something he saw, something that haunted him. He didn't talk much, but he was always looking over his shoulder as if he expected something terrible to happen." Michelle squinted, trying to process this new information. Did he mention anything about what he saw? Anything specific? The woman looked around, as if fearing she would be overheard. He said he witnessed something he shouldn't have, something involving powerful people, people you don't want to mess with. I don't know more than that, but the poor boy was terrified. He said he would never be safe no matter where he went. These words hung in the air like poison. Michelle felt a chill down her spine. The idea that Dylan was running from something or someone only deepened her desperation. What could he have seen that would make him live in such terror? And more importantly, who could be after him? Thanking the woman, Michelle stood up and left the shelter, with John following closely behind. She was shaken, but also determined to keep going. She needed to find Dylan before it was too late, before the fear that was consuming him destroyed him completely. On the way back to the car, Michelle felt a growing pressure in her chest. The mystery surrounding Dylan's disappearance seemed increasingly dark, and she knew she couldn't solve this alone. She needed help, someone with the skills to deal with powerful and dangerous people. But who? She thought of Alan, her former son-in-law, but the idea of turning to him disgusted her. After all, wasn't he the one involved in shady dealings? And what if he had something to do with what happened to Dylan? With these doubts haunting her mind, Michelle decided she needed more information before making any decisions. As soon as she got home, she would make more calls, contact old acquaintances, and use all her influence to find out what was going on. As the car glided through the dark streets of New York, Michelle looked at John. He was silent, his eyes fixed on the window, but something in his expression suggested that he knew more than he was letting on. Perhaps he was still processing everything, or maybe he had his own fears and secrets. Michelle knew that to find Dylan, she would need John's help, but she also needed to be prepared for any revelations that might come to light. Finally, they arrived at Michelle's mansion, an imposing structure on the Upper East Side. John hesitated as he got out of the car, clearly intimidated by the grandeur of the place. Michelle guided him inside, ignoring the curious expressions of the staff who watched him pass. She had no time for explanations or justifications. Her mind was entirely focused on the next step. She led John to one of the guest rooms, decorated with luxury and comfort, but which for him seemed like something out of a distant dream. "You can stay here while I make some calls. Rest, eat something. You're safe now," Michelle said, trying to reassure him. John nodded, still looking lost but grateful. Michelle left the room and went straight to the study, where she picked up the phone and began making calls. She contacted old, influential friends, private detectives, and even some contacts she knew had connections to New York's underworld. She needed information. She needed to know who these powerful people were that were after Dylan, and why. As she waited for answers, Michelle felt the tension mounting. She knew she was getting involved in something dangerous, but she also knew she had no choice. Finding Dylan was the only thing that mattered. But with each new piece of information, with each new clue, she felt She was getting closer to a truth that could be devastating. Hours later, when night had already fallen over New York, Michelle's phone rang. It was one of the private detectives she had hired. "Michelle, I did some digging. Apparently your grandson might be involved in something bigger than we thought. He may have witnessed a crime linked to a corruption network. And the people involved, well, they're not the kind to leave loose ends." Michelle felt the ground fall from under her feet. The detective's words confirmed her worst fears. Dylan wasn't just running, he was in real danger, and time was running out. "Keep investigating," she said, trying to keep her voice calm. "I need more information. I need to know exactly who we're dealing with." After hanging up, Michelle felt the weight of the situation crashing down on her shoulders. It was clear that what lay ahead would be difficult, perhaps even deadly. But she wouldn't stop. Not now. Not when she was so close to uncovering the truth. When she returned to John's room, she found him awake, sitting on the bed with a serious expression. "Something's wrong, isn't it?" he asked, reading the tension on Michelle's face. She nodded, slowly. "Yes, John. Something is very wrong. But we're going to figure this out together. I need your help, and you need mine. We're not giving up on Dylan no matter what happens." John looked at her for a long moment and then, with a deep sigh, agreed. "I'm with you, Mum. We'll see this through wherever it takes us." And so, with the weight of a dark mystery hanging over them, Michelle and John prepared for the battle ahead. A battle that would test their limits, reveal long-buried secrets, and that one way or another would change their lives forever. Michelle woke early the next morning, feeling the weight of the day ahead. The night had been long, filled with nightmares where Dylan was being chased by shadows she couldn't quite identify. But the panic on his face was unmistakable. Each time she woke, gasping and with her heart racing, she reminded herself that this wasn't just a dream. It was the reality her grandson could be living. John was already awake, sitting at the dining table with a cup of coffee in his trembling hands. He looked stronger than he had the day before, as if the decision to help Michelle find Dylan had given him a new reason to live. Michelle felt a twinge of gratitude seeing him there, knowing she wouldn't be facing this alone. "John, today we're going to need your memory," Michelle said as she sat down across from him. "We need to remember every detail, every clue, to find Dylan, what he might have seen, where he might be now." John nodded slowly, taking a sip of coffee before responding. "I remember he mentioned a place where something happened, but my memory is in pieces. It's like there's a fog in my head, but I'll try." Michelle took a deep breath. "We'll figure it out together. I have some contacts who are investigating the corruption network, but we need more information to pressure them." As they spoke, Michelle's phone rang. It was one of the private detectives she had hired. "Mrs. Richardson, I've got some information about the shelter where your grandson stayed. Apparently it's a meeting point for people who want to disappear, as you already know. But we've discovered that Dylan wasn't the only one passing through recently. Another young man, who was also on the run from something, was seen talking with Dylan on several occasions. He might have more information." Michael's heart raced. "Were you able to locate this young man?" "Yes, ma'am. He's in a small apartment in Williamsburg. It's a simple place, but he's safe for now. If you'd like, I can accompany you there." Michael accepted the offer without hesitation. If this young man knew Dylan, then he might be the key to finally finding him. She said goodbye to John, who preferred to stay at the house, still recovering from the exhaustion and difficulties of the past few days, and left with the detective towards Brooklyn. The drive to Williamsburg was quiet, with Michel lost in thought. The bustling city streets, always full of life, seemed distant to her. All that mattered now was the possibility of finally finding Dylan, of bringing him home. They arrived at the building the detective had indicated, an old building with a worn facade but still standing. Michel climbed the stairs with determined steps, trying to control the anxiety that gripped her body. The detective stopped in front of a door on the third floor and knocked 3 times. The door opened slowly, revealing a young man in his early 20s, with tired eyes and a wary expression. He looked at Michel, then at the detective before fully opening the door. "You're Dylan's grandmother, aren't you?" he asked in a low voice. "Yes, I am," Michel replied, trying not to let her emotions show. "Please tell me, do you know where he is?" The young man hesitated but then nodded. "Come in. We need to talk." Michel entered the modest apartment, where the smell of canned food and old coffee permeated the air. They sat at the small kitchen table, where the young man, who introduced himself as Peter, began to speak. "Dylan and I met at the shelter. He was always tense, always afraid someone would find him. He didn't talk much about his past, but one night he finally told me what happened. He saw something he wasn't supposed to see." Michel leaned forward, holding her breath. "What did he see?" "He saw his father," Peter said, choosing his words carefully. "He saw his father and other men involved in something dangerous. Dylan said he saw a money exchange, a lot of money, and heard discussions about bribes and even murders. He wasn't supposed to be there. It was a coincidence. But they saw him, and ever since then, he's been running. He was sure they would kill him if he was found." Michel felt the ground fall away beneath her feet. She knew Alan, Dylan's father, had questionable business dealings, but she never imagined he could be involved in something so serious. And where is Dylan now? Is he still here? Peter looked at her with sadness. "I don't know. The last time I saw him he was even more scared. He said he had to leave the city, that it was getting too dangerous to stay. He mentioned a place he was planning to go, but I don't know if he actually went there." "Where?" Michel insisted, urgency in her voice. Peter took a deep breath. He said he was going to Canada, that maybe by crossing the border he would be safe. But that was weeks ago. I don't know if he made it. Michel felt hope slipping through her fingers. Dylan could be anywhere now, or he could already be lost forever. She thanked Peter for the information, even though it confirmed the danger surrounding her grandson. She left the apartment with the detective by her side, both silent as they descended the stairs. Once outside the building, Michel stopped, looking at the distant horizon. What should she do now? Searching for Dylan in Canada seemed like an almost impossible task, and the fear that something terrible had happened to him intensified. The detective, sensing Michel's distress, gently touched her shoulder. "Mrs. Richardson, perhaps we should talk to Alan. If he's involved in this, he might have an idea where Dylan is, or at least be able to help in some way." Michel looked at the detective, her eyes filled with a mix of anger and despair. The last person she wanted to turn to was Alan, but he was right. Alan might have vital information, and there was no more time for hesitation. She needed to confront him. Upon arriving at Alan's mansion, Michel felt tension rising in her body. It was an opulent structure, a reflection of Alan's financial success, but for Michel it represented the heart of the darkness her family had become entangled in. She didn't bother announcing her arrival. She entered unannounced, her face determined, and Alan was in his office, bent over a desk full of papers. Seeing Michel, he stood up, surprised. "Michel, what are you doing here? We need to talk," she said, entering the office and closing the door behind her. "Now." Alan noticed the seriousness on Michelle's face and gestured for her to sit, but she remained standing, her eyes fixed on him. "I know what you did, Alan. I know Dylan is on the run because he saw something you were involved in, and I need to know what happened." Alan hesitated, his gaze hardening. "Michelle, you don't know what you're talking about. It's not safe for you to get involved in this." Michelle took a step forward, her voice firm. "I don't care. Dylan is my grandson. I need to know where he is. You're the only one who can help me." Alan took a deep breath, running his hand through his hair in a nervous gesture. "Dylan, he got caught up in something he shouldn't have. He saw a transaction, yes, a bribe. I was trying to protect our family, Michelle. I was trying to keep everything under control. But Dylan, he got scared and ran." Michael felt anger bubbling inside her. "So it's true. You involved my grandson in something dangerous, and now he's running because of you." Alan looked at her with sadness. "I didn't want this to happen. I tried to find a way to fix it, but the people I'm dealing with aren't the forgiving type." Michelle felt fear turn to despair. "And where is he now? Do you know where he might be?" Alan slowly shook his head. "He mentioned he might go to Canada, but since he fled, I haven't been able to locate him. I'm trying, Michelle. I'm trying to find a way to fix this." Michelle realized at that moment that Alan was in as much trouble as Dylan. They were all caught in a web of lies and dangers that grew by the day, but she couldn't just accept this. She needed to find Dylan before it was too late. "You're going to help me find him, Alan," Michelle said, the determination in her voice impossible to ignore. "And if you don't, I promise the whole world will know what you did." Alan knew Michelle was serious. He sighed, resigned. "I'll do what I can." "But this isn't going to be easy, Michelle. The people involved are dangerous." Michelle looked at him intently. "I'm not afraid of danger, Alan. I'm afraid of losing my grandson. Now, let's start looking." The following days were a whirlwind of activity. Alan used his contacts to try to track down Dylan, while Michelle conducted her own investigations. They discovered that Dylan had indeed tried to cross the border into Canada, but had disappeared before reaching his destination. The lead was weak, but it gave them a direction. During the search, Michael reached out to people who had known Dylan in recent years, trying to understand what he had been through. With each new discovery, it became increasingly clear that Dylan was being hunted, not just by fear, but by men who wanted to eliminate him. The watch he had given to John was a symbolic farewell, but Michael refused to believe that Dylan had completely given up. Finally, after weeks of intense searching and sleepless nights, Michelle received a call that would change everything. "Mrs. Richardson, we've found a trail," the detective said. "Dylan was spotted at a hotel near the Canadian border. It appears he managed to make it across, but he's hurt." Michelle felt her heart skip a beat. "Hurt? What do you mean?" "He was attacked, but he got away. He's in hiding, trying to recover. We need to leave now, before his pursuers catch up to him." Without hesitation, Michelle gathered her belongings and, along with Alan and the detective, set off toward the border. The journey was tense, with Michelle grappling with fear and hope, unsure if she would find Dylan alive or dead. They reached the hotel by dusk. It was a modest, nearly abandoned place, surrounded by thick forests and remote trails. The detective had arranged with the hotel owner to keep Dylan hidden until they arrived. As Michael entered the room, her legs almost gave way. Dylan was lying on the bed, pale, with visible wounds on his face and arms. He looked at her, his eyes filled with pain and surprise. "Grandma!" Michael rushed to him, clutching his hand tightly. "Dylan, my dear, I've found you, finally." I've found you. Dylan attempted a smile, but the pain was obvious. I knew you'd come, Grandma. But I couldn't return. They were after me. Tears streamed down Michelle's face, but she refused to release Dylan's hand. You're safe now. I'll take care of you. Alan entered the room, gazing at his son with a mix of relief and guilt. Dylan, I'm sorry. Dylan looked at him coldly. You should have protected me. You should have protected us. Alan bowed his head, knowing that Dylan's words were true. He had failed to protect his family, and now he was trying to make amends for the mistakes he had made. We're leaving this place, Michelle said, taking charge of the situation. We're taking you somewhere safe, where no one will be able to find you. They left the hotel, with Dylan supported by Michelle and Alan, who helped him walk. The detective stayed behind, ensuring they weren't followed. The journey back was slow, but with each passing mile, they felt closer to safety. At last, they arrived at a small house in the countryside, far from the city and the dangers that had pursued them. Here, Dylan began to recover, both physically and emotionally, with the help of his grandmother. Alan, who remained by his son's side, tried to earn back his trust, although he knew the path to redemption would be long. Michelle, for her part, knew the fight wasn't over. The people who wanted Dylan were still out there, and she would do everything in her power to make sure they never hurt him again. She had weathered the storm, but now she was determined to protect what was left of her family. And so, with the shadows of the past still looming over them, Michelle, Dylan, and Alan began to rebuild their lives. They knew the road ahead would be long and difficult, but there was one thing they would never lose again: the bond they had rediscovered. Together, they would face any challenge, certain that no matter what happened, they would always be there for each other.